All right, so we have our guest speaker. I'll just give him a brief intro. His name's Jordan. He's an entrepreneur. He works at the intersection of technology and sport training, athletics, weightlifting, and anything about the gym. He's kind of touching right now. It's a really cool guy, and I'll let him kind of take it off from here.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. I'm looking forward to this. I love giving this presentation. I gave it last year, so I think there might be one person here who's seen it before. If so, I tweaked it a little bit so you'll get something new. But to kind of summarize what I do, first, I own and operate a couple of gyms in New York City, and those gyms are called Squats and Science. And the science part of my gyms is what we're talking about today, which is a different company I run called Rep One Strength. And Rep One Strength is a training automation platform for teams and athletes. And so they put our sensors in their weight room, and they put tablets up with our software, and they can use that to automate some really cool kind of individualized training. So let me share my screen. And I'll first start, can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Great. So I will first start by showing you a little bit about what I work on. And then I'll go into some of my favorite logical fallacies and biases in the engineering process. So this is the current hardware state from the last time I gave this presentation. It was just a render at that point. This is a little video of the actual shipped product. So as of now, we've shipped about 300 of these, and the audio doesn't really mean anything. And we have another 400 units worth of parts coming in next week. So my life's about to get very busy. And then here's a quick video that can show you the concept around training automation. You have a room full of athletes. You'll see tablets on the rack. Our devices are on the floor. The coach gets all this data streamed to a tablet in their hand, and they could discuss it with their athletes and make kind of live recommendations. So that gives you a little bit of an intro, and the rest of this is going to be about some of my favorite ways to poorly do kind of prototyping and iteration. When I was young, about your age, I was totally unfamiliar with the word process. So when I got into, even through college, so when I got into the workplace, it caught me by surprise. But this is what this is about. Process is how you overcome some of the issues that are tightly ingrained in the brains of humans through years of thousands and thousands of years of evolution. So I'll go over some of the ways, some of the key problems that might pop up in terms of logical fallacies and biases, and then ways to kind of prevent those or help your way through those. So the first one, anchoring and confirmation bias. So this is a popular example here. If you give, this was done in several studies, if you tell individuals to think of a number 1 through 100, and then bid on a bottle of wine, the person who thought about a lower number will likely bid lower. The person who thought of a higher number would bid higher. So what that means is anchoring bias kind of represents what you take into a problem and how that bias is your view of the solution. And confirmation bias is kind of a little bit of a different version on this. Essentially, you take information that you see and you use that to confirm your initial presumptions, whether or not that actually should confirm those presumptions. So how to help yourself in overcoming anchoring and confirmation bias. Make a list of those assumptions. And these lists can be enormous. When you're developing a really complex product, it can be everything from the ground up about the entire design process, and it could be a little bit daunting. You want to form a hypothesis on how those assumptions could be wrong, and then test those hypotheses. The scientific process is really good at finding out what the truth of a situation is. But in order to do that, you have to be a blank slate and allow yourself to approach something without any kind of preconceived notions or whatever information that you're kind of dragging with you into a situation. How to help others. So if you're trying to work in a group or in a company when you eventually get a job, you want to ask probing questions. So very specific things to kind of work around what people might be bringing into the conversation. Discuss the topic again on a different day or time. That's very useful in engineering. If somebody has something that they're bringing with them, well, rather than try to rehash the situation or rather than trying to prod the person too hard, talk it again at a different time. Maybe they'll have different answers or different solutions. And one key thing to watch out for is telling people how they think or feel. People really do not like that. I wouldn't use that as a solution. If you notice something and you think maybe somebody's bringing something stressful with them, that's not a solution. I would just defer to number two, kind of talk it out at a different time when maybe they're not having that stressor. Sunk cost fallacy. This is a good one. So this little illustration here shows a dog that thinks they left their bone somewhere. And after a little bit of time, they cannot be convinced that the bone is not there. And so they end up in a deeply different place than when they began. So essentially, if you spend a lot of time on a problem, you have a bias against quitting when maybe you should. So how to help yourself through sunk cost fallacy: regularly assess the viability of the current path. This is something that you improve on every time you build a product or do a project. You want to give yourself an opportunity to figure out if the path that you're on is a good path and a productive path. One way to do that is to keep a pros and cons list and update it throughout the process. And then the key thing is to be ruthless. So your ideas are not you, and that's kind of a theme that you'll see throughout this presentation. Sometimes you have to, quote unquote, kill your baby, they say, right? So if you think this idea that you've been nurturing for so long defines you, well, it doesn't. It's just an idea, and sometimes you have to get rid of those ideas for better ones. How to help others with the sunk cost fallacy. So discuss their level of investment in the current path. That could be time investment, money investment. Just help them come to that realization. Evaluate future cost of continuing on the current path. So if you stop and spend the time actually evaluating the dollars and cents or the hours of what's left versus a different path, that can help you get through this sticking point. And another thing to watch out for here is to get buy-in. So one of the most common reasons people end up quitting their engineering jobs is because they'll spend a lot of time on a problem, a lot of time on a project, and that project gets abandoned. And even though it might be a bias, the leadership might have a very good reason to abandon that project. It's frustrating, and people really might not like that. So it's important to get buy-in if you're in that leadership position. The backfire effect. So this is a fun one. I don't know if anybody here has seen I Think You Should Leave, but this has been kind of popular on YouTube. Can you guys hear audio, by the way?
You'd have to turn on the audio sharing in the view screen, in the share screen settings.
Okay.
If you do like new share screen, there's a little checkbox in the bottom left corner.
Okay, so I'm going to stop share and then new share?
Yeah.
Stop share. Share computer sound, beautiful.
It look. Okay, what do we think it should look like?
Sleek.
Good.
High tech.
Aerodynamic.
Too small.
I'm sorry?
Too small. So when you get in there, you're like, is the steering wheel fly off and toast?
Okay, I don't know why we'd make it too small.
I think it's a good idea, and I'm standby.
So that's the backfire effect. If you approach somebody who has an idea and you tell them maybe not very tactfully it's not a good idea, that might backfire and they might dig in. So how to help yourself. It's always an important practice to try to figure out how the other person could be right. If they tell you that what you said or maybe some of your thoughts might not be the most pragmatic approach, instead of immediately denying their opinion, first think, could they be right? Here's that theme pumping up again. Your ideas are not you. It's important to note that, if you think when you're designing a car that it should be too small, well, that idea does not represent who you are. And if somebody says that that's not the most pragmatic approach, you might want to hear them out. And keep an open mind. So Again, that's kind of the theme of this problem. Listen to other people's thoughts. How to help others. So separate the person from their idea. There's several techniques on this, and there's ways you can do this more effectively than others. But in communication, make sure if you're, providing critical feedback, you're providing it on the idea, not the person. It's also very useful to find the good in the idea. Even if an idea might not align with what you think is most pragmatic, there could be some good in it. And identifying that for the person who created the idea can help you guide them through a different path. The framing effect. This one is very powerful, and there's books written on this. It's how a lot of kind of marketing is done. You'll see, in frozen yogurt, you'll never see 20% fat, but you will see almost everywhere 80% fat-free, even though it's the same thing. And that's because the framing of that product tends to lead the person to want it in the latter scenario. All right, a little bit of a markup issue there. So how to help yourself? Actively fight bad context. So you train yourself, and over time you'll notice things like 20% fat-free and 80% fat, and you'll be able to fight that bad context. And when in doubt, frame the problem yourself. So if somebody's framing something for you, if you think they might be putting things in a light that might bias your opinion on something, reframe it and kind of do that for yourself. And how to help others, be very purposeful in how you present a question. So a lot of times the framing effect can backfire on you. If you're trying to present a problem to a team or to your group, and you present that problem poorly, it might create issues in how people make their suggestions. And that can happen a lot. It's very, very common. Structured brainstorming is a way to go through this. So there's a lot of techniques on this. Again, books and books are written on structured brainstorming. One of the important things to do is get your group in a different setting, right? If you're doing a project, rather than do it in class, where people have brought in maybe their stress from the homework that they did the day before, or maybe the teacher just outlined something that could impact the way you all think through the problem, it might be better to have that structured brainstorming session somewhere else. Groupthink is another powerful one, especially in the context of things like summer camps. Groupthink is when everybody just tends to jump on the bandwagon. It's also called the bandwagon effect, even though internally they might be thinking something else. How to help yourself. So don't be afraid to dissent, but just make sure when you do dissent, don't do it for the sake of dissenting. That comes off as a little bit problematic, especially when everybody's trying to contribute. The best leaders love a good devil's advocate. And this is something you hear a lot in the professional world. If you have really good contrary ideas, don't be afraid to share them. A lot of people like hearing those because it ends up bringing new thoughts, new ideas, and new paths to the conversation. Always question whether or not you're simply going with the group. That's just something you could always be aware of. How to help others. So find a really good devil's advocate. It's kind of the inverse of what was mentioned in the previous slide. Again, leaders love good devil's advocates. If you're in a leadership position, find that devil's advocate and hold on tightly to them because they're pretty rare. So if you have somebody who thinks up contrary ideas, and those contrary ideas tend to be very helpful, keep that person around. And then vocally support and encourage non-conforming ideas. So if you hear people talk about things, whether or not those ideas are the most pragmatic or whether or not you fully agree with them, if you vocally support non-conforming ideas, it'll end up leading to others that could be more useful. The availability heuristic. This is one of the most common ones, and it's for a very obvious reason. So when you make a decision, you only have the decision you have available to you. It sounds like a very obvious thing to say, but as you can see in this graph here, usually you have a very small portion of the available information. This is kind of a cousin to the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Which is the less you know, the more you think you know, and then the inverse as you know more. So to help yourself against the availability heuristic, so recognize that the first, easiest, most available idea won't always be the right one. It's usually the easiest one to come across, but the easiest and first idea is very likely never the correct one. Memory is incredibly faulty. Memory as a tool for decision making and for data is not to be trusted. So especially as you age, Jesse and I will attest, your memory tends to fade. It's inversely proportional to the amount of times you've circled the sun. So don't depend on memory. If somebody questions or a recollection and that question is integral to the decision-making process, you might want to listen to them. How to help others. So encourage diversity. Diversity is a strong tool in helping prevent a small bubble of available information. Diverse backgrounds tends to lead to diverse information brought to a problem. Learn the education or experience or background of your colleagues. So if you can know those things, then maybe you can know where their strong suits are and maybe where they lack experience. We're almost through here. The halo effect. So in this little cartoon here, this dog sees another dog with a beautiful, luxurious coat. And that dog thinks, man, that beautiful dog must be a really good boy. But, you go home and they might not be. The halo effect is essentially your preconceived notions or the kind of surface level observations do not necessarily intimate the actual the actual realistic situation. So how to help yourself against the halo effect. So treat everybody as equals when presenting ideas. If you're aware the halo effect exists, don't give your best friend the benefit of the doubt over somebody else who's new to the group. Be purposeful in evaluating the ideas alone on their merits. Again, separate the idea from the person. And how to help others. So recognize patterns in behavior. If if you tend to be focusing on one person's ideas more than everybody else's, you should recognize that pattern. Same thing in reverse. If somebody's focusing on a group mate's ideas more than yours, more than somebody else's, it's worth recognizing. Try not to be spiteful in those situations, but take that as information and kind of move forward pragmatically. And anonymous feedback and brainstorming. Obviously, if you separate the idea literally from the person and make it anonymous, the halo effect just kind of disappears. And that's the presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to hear them. Did I do good on time?
Yeah, so we have about maybe like 7 minutes or so. We definitely have to cut it off at like 3 minutes before the hour so I can start the next class. So is anyone curious about being an entrepreneur, designing your own product, or questions about Jordan's like build process or what he's doing? Anything like that?
I'm sorry. I think I missed the point in the beginning when you mentioned how to ask questions. Should I type it out or can I just say it?
You could just say it.
Okay, cool. In terms of entrepreneurship or entrepreneurialism, what's the most important person to hire when you're first starting a business? Like, who's the first person you should hire?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it depends, and I might kind of tweak your question a little bit if you don't mind. A lot of the time in the beginning, the first person you work with is a partner, right? And that's true for both my gym businesses and for my tech businesses. And so if you're thinking about who the first person you want to work with, who might not necessarily be on the payroll, they might take an equal share in the company or at least a percentage of equity. You want that person to fill, if it's a technical project, a lot of your technical deficit. So obviously I don't develop apps, and if I wanted to develop an app with my hardware, I'm going to need to work with an app developer. That's an easy one. And then in terms of first hire, there are certain skills that are valuable that your team could be lacking after your founding team has developed a lot of the product. And so if that's the case, then obviously it's the first place to hire. And if you mean this question in terms of like, when I've talked to venture capital investors, a lot of the time they advise an early hire to be in sales or marketing, especially because, this is an engineering group, right? And so we all tend to be what's called product focused. Engineers build the things, right? But a product is not a company. A A company is built around customer acquisition. It's built around all kinds of interesting things like sales funnels and marketing. So a lot of the time for us engineers, the first hire is going to have to be somebody non-technical, somebody in marketing or somebody in sales. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. We have a question from Santino in the chat asking about how do you avoid bias in your own thoughts?
So that's a tough one. In my company, it's one of our kind of core values. It's to always try to be objective, and the try is the main part, because if somebody is exhibiting some logical fallacy or cognitive bias, it's not their fault. We all do it, no matter how hard you try. It's all about practice. So if you're open, it's funny. I've always disliked when people say, don't listen to the haters, right? You hear that a lot. Don't listen to the haters. Well, I mean, by the common societal definition, a hater is somebody who is potentially questioning some of your biases, right? So you have to practice listening to those people. Sometimes it's really uncomfortable, right? If you have an idea that you hold dearly, and that idea kind of feels vulnerable to share, and if somebody criticizes that idea, it feels like they're criticizing you. Over time, you'll be able to kind of fight those feelings and separate the idea from the person, and then listen to those thoughts, listen to people's opinions, and then you can start incorporating those into your thought processes. Another tip is there's these really wonderful posters you can get for cognitive biases and logical fallacies, and I bought them and I hung them up in our office. And they used to be at the gym. I think Jesse's seen them before. And so if it comes up, very friendly. People don't like it when you point to the poster after they say something. So be nice about it. But if it comes up, reference the poster, read the poster. If you feel like you're falling victim to a bias, just take a quick glance through that poster and learn them like the back of your hand. It'll be very helpful.
Thanks. We had a question from Mindy in the chat asking about motivating employees and coworkers. So how do you kind of motivate them if you notice they're getting distracted or can't concentrate? Like, how do you keep that team working well?
Yeah, so that's another incredibly difficult question to answer. And contextually, there's a lot of research that shows that millennials in Gen Z, and I don't know what's after Gen Z. Is this group even Gen Z? What are we?
We'll just call it millennials for now.
Oh, for now. We'll talk more about this later. Yeah, so we tend to be, I'm a millennial myself, we tend to be very hard to motivate. Millennials aren't necessarily money motivated. And a lot of the reason why is because when we grew up, our parents told us that we should do something we love, which is in a lot of ways very true. So we tend to be motivated by passion. We tend to be motivated by ownership. We tend to be motivated by a positive affirmation. And those things go a very long way. So if you're in a leadership position and you're working with people who feel dejected, don't make things up. Don't try to manipulate them. Find things you genuinely think are positive about the way they're thinking about a problem or the way they're approaching a problem. And you'll be surprised how far that goes.
She says, thank you. I don't know if you have the chat open.
Sure. Yeah, I see some blinking orange up here.
So we still have time for maybe like one or two more questions. Does anyone have any questions? I have a question. Jordan, so one of the things that is intimidating for me when I think about starting my own business is going through like the funding process. And I know that you spent a long time going through that. Could you talk just a little bit about what that's like and kind of how it works?
Yeah. So I'll split this up into two main categories, and I could talk about this for hours. There's external capital and what's called bootstrapping. So external capital is raising money from, it could be friends and family. It could be what are called angel investors, which are just traditionally wealthy individuals, or angel groups, which are groups of wealthy individuals. Venture capital investors, which are people who raise money on behalf of others for a living. And then there's traditional capital, so like banks and stuff. If you're running a very good mom and pop business, let's say you're running a custom furniture shop, well, traditional capital might be accessible to you because you have the cash flow and the credit history. Venture capital is for new ventures or young ventures who are a little bit more risky. And more, as we go on, it's more difficult to raise some venture capital, and it looks a lot more close to traditional capital. But they're looking for very specific things, and it's really difficult to go into that in more detail. But there's all kinds of books on that. I'm going to go with the way I've done it, and I've bootstrapped the gyms, and I've bootstrapped the tech company. Bootstrapping essentially means not raising money, and there's a few really interesting tricks. So number one, build good credit. Okay, if you have good credit, and a lot of the time that just means a long credit history. So just start now. If you build good credit, then you can get business credit cards for $10,000 or $15,000 or more that have 0% APR for over a year. It's a very specific suggestion, but I've used it at almost every corner of my business ventures, and that money can go a long way. Obviously, save really well. That helps. If you have partners that you want to work with in a company, those partners can become investors. A lot of the time, to become a partner, there is an equity purchase that they do to sign the ownership agreement. So if you partner with somebody who has some cash, that can help. And I would consider friends and family bootstrapping technically as well. And so, it's kind of a very privileged thing to say. And I've never raised friends and family money. I just don't kind of have that accessible. But if you have friends or family who want to put in a few $1,000s here and there, that's sometimes a good option. Although, raising money from friends can be very stressful. And if you can avoid it, I would go with the first options. And then also pre-orders. These days, if you're building a hardware product, pre-orders are very common. It's becoming an experience that everybody's used to. And I've done pre-orders at gyms, right? You pre-sell memberships. It can be done in a lot of different ways. And you could also think outside of the box. For one of the gyms, we ran a competition with $10,000 of athlete sign-up fees. And those fees paid for part of the build out of one of the gyms. And then later on, as we started operating, we used the operation money to pay for the meet. So these are just creative ways you can do it that'll be specific to your business.
Amazing. Well, I think that's the end of our time for now. If anyone has questions that don't have time to get answered, please send them to me, and I'll try and bother Jordan to answer them when he's got a couple minutes afterward. So I'm gonna